Why do you think so many people fear uncertainty despite how certain uncertainty is?
A couple of reasons. I think first, the human condition is to generate certainty. We are, as humans, always looking to explain our surroundings, our events, the things that are happening. We want that type of fidelity. It just makes us comfortable. I think the second reason has to do with the fact that uncertainty can come in literally any flavor, can come from any angle, any flavor. And even though uncertainty is certain, the flavor of uncertainty is not it's not certain. You don't know what's going to hit. So it truly is, kind of the unknown, which I think adds to that anxiety level when it does happen.
I also think that people experience different levels of uncertainty. They deal with like the certain uncertainty where they like go into their day and they're like, you know what, like I have a job right now. I have my family. I don't know what's going to transpire over the next 24 hours, but I imagine things are going to be okay. And then there's like the unexpected uncertainty, which happens when something traumatic happens, you get some horrible news, you lose your job, etc. What's the playbook for people to deal with an unexpected life event in the moment?
Let's break down a little bit of what you said, because I think there's the types of uncertainty it's meaningful in the terms of, we can have uncertainty that is not necessarily, it's not adding anxiety, or anxiety is not added to it. And this is kind of what Andrew Huberman and I know, you and I are both good friends with Andrew, but Andrew and I talked about this idea that fear and anxiety, fear specifically is a combination of uncertainty plus anxiety. That's when fear starts to bubble up. In other words, you can have uncertainty without anxiety. You can have anxiety without uncertainty too. But uncertainty without anxiety is every kid on Christmas Eve. Okay. So if there's uncertainty that one is curious about, it's going to be a whole different way to approach that. It's going to be a positive approach. It's not necessarily in that challenging realm. But let's just sidebar that type of uncertainty and speak to the preponderance of uncertainty that humans deal with, like you said. And that's something hitting you that you never expected. And I think one of the things that we have to understand as humans is we tend to want to act in the moment. But when you're in an uncertain environment, your first job is not necessarily to act, it's to understand, because you can't figure out what to do unless you begin to generate some sort of understanding. And this goes into the very seeds of how uncertainty shows up in our physiology. And really, one of the primary concepts of the book is this idea that our brains are always looking to explain our events, our perspectives, our experiences through three lenses. Those lenses are duration, how long it's going to last, is this going to last? Pathway, what's my route, out of it or through it? And then outcome, what's happening at the end? And when we are in absence of one or more of that, of duration, pathway, or outcome, we begin to feel anxiety. That uncertainty turns into anxiety. So you can be in a situation where you, for example, are caught in traffic, and you're sitting in traffic and you see maybe a half mile down the road that there's a car, and the car is getting put onto a tow truck and going to get towed away. So at that moment, you have a pathway. You know the route out because the car's and you know the outcome. You know you're going to get out. You know the pathway. You just don't know the duration, right? So you're absent one, which means you may have mild anxiousness because you might be late, but it's mild. If, however, now you're in traffic and the cars are stopped, you can't see ahead of you. You don't know what's going on, but your app tells you that traffic's going to clear in 5 minutes or 7 minutes. Then you have, you're in absence of two. You don't know, well, I shouldn't say no. Say the app says, traffic will clear, but doesn't give it a time. Now you're in absence of duration and you're in absence of pathway, but you know the outcome. So you have more uncertainty. But now imagine you're in traffic and the cars are stopped around you and your app's telling you nothing. You can't see anything and people are actually getting out of their cars. Now you're in absence of duration, pathway, and outcome. And that anxiety is actually bubbling over. And so what we have to understand is neurologically, our brains are looking for these three factors. And the more we can do in an uncertain environment to give ourselves some answers to those three, the better off we're going to do, which is what I talk about.
Like, which one do you think is the most important for people to attack first? Because, I think about the idea of my show, The Adversity Advantage. I think one of the biggest problems people have is like, how long is this problem going to last? Like, how long am I going to be unemployed? How long am I going to be single? How long am I going to be experiencing this super negative thing going on in my life? And I think once people have an idea of when the end date is, they're like, okay, I have some peace now, because now I can understand, like, well, I only have to make it 3 months, then I'll meet the love of my life. I only need to make it 6 weeks and I'll find a job. So which part do you think is the most important for people to tackle first?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think from my experience and what I understand is that the good news is that you can actually create all three parts by understanding the technique to do it. When I talk about moving your horizons in the book and this strategy for moving in and through uncertainty, challenge, and stress, moving horizons is simply picking something to focus on so that you're creating all three elements. Okay. You're creating a duration, pathway, and outcome by picking something to focus on and move towards. That horizon can be far away, it can be close, it can be whatever it is. But when you're in a situation of uncertainty, challenge, and stress, the idea is to ask yourself, okay, what do I know and what can I control in this moment? What can I focus on in this moment? And as soon as you do that, you've created for yourself a horizon, or a DPO, duration, pathway, outcome, short, DPO for short, because you've created something that you can focus on. You create an outcome. Because you know what the outcome is, you have a pathway to get there, and then you have a duration. You generally know how long it's going to take to get there. So there's no real weight on any of the three. It's really about pick a horizon that can actually create all three for you, and then move to that. And then once you move to that, you've generated a reward system in your neurology. You get a dopamine reward so that you come back out. And if you're not through the event, then you pick another horizon and you move to something else. It's literally the neurological equivalent of eating the elephant one bite at a time. But when we're talking about an uncertain environment, we're talking about chunking the environment in a way that I'm just going to move to what I understand and know. And then once I'm there, I'm going to pick something else that I understand and know.
And so the idea is essentially focus on what you can control, be consistent, and do it, every day.
Yeah, every day, but it might even be every minute. It might even be, I mean, again, the consistency is really about generating DPOs. What people have to understand is that you have to create what's called a meaningful horizon. In other words, how long and what is that chunk I'm biting off? Because our dopamine reward system is designed so that if we pick too big of a chunk, our dopamine is going to run out. We're not going to have enough motivation to get there, right? If we pick too little of a chunk, we're not going to get the reward from it. So here's an example from SEAL training, which I know you know a lot and you've talked a lot and your audience is familiar. But SEAL training, obviously, very, very difficult. Hell Week is the crucible of buds, where you start on a Sunday afternoon and you go until that following Friday, sleeping basically 2 hours, the 2.5, maybe 3 hours the entire week, right? And you spend hundreds of hours running around with big, heavy boats on your hand. You have to go everywhere with your heavy boat. And I remember being on the beach. We were running on the beach with the boats on our head, and it's, I don't know, some god-awful hour in the morning, miserable. And we're on the beach next to a sand berm. And I remember saying to myself, you know what? I'm just going to focus on getting to the end of this sand berm. Right. And what I did, unbeknownst to me, is I created a DPO through picking a horizon. I basically said, okay, duration from now until end of sand berm, pathway from here to end of sand berm, and outcome end of sand berm. And in doing that, I created a DPO, and all I needed to do was focus on getting that end of that sand berm. And as soon as I did, I got a dopamine reward for that. That allowed me to say, okay, what's my next horizon? The next horizon, I don't remember what it was, but it could have been, I'm just going to wait till the next meal. That might be my horizon. Sometimes when I was freezing in the surf zone, getting surf tortured, I'd say, I'm just going to count 5 waves. That'll be the horizon. That'll be the DPO. And so the DPO and the horizon has to be contextual to the environment. And it has to be meaningful enough to that individual. It's a very individually created event. And the length or size of that chunk often is relative to the intensity of the environment, i.e., the more intense the environment, likely that's the smaller that chunk is going to have to be. But it really is quite dependent on the individual.
Well, and I think people might be listening to this or watching this, and those who are familiar with SEAL training was like, well, as difficult as it is, and is as much as like, I don't know what the percentage of people who go through it and survive, it's like 0.00001% or whatever the data is. You would know more than me. They're like, how does that relate to me? Because at least with that, like when things are over, right? That there's going to be some end date. If you complete a certain thing, you're going to get through the training and you're going to become a Navy SEAL. I think what happens is in life, in everyday life for people, there is no like end date. There is no like, well, it'd be easy to say like, yeah, just fill out 10 job applications. And if I do that at the end, I'll get the job. But that's just not how.
Again, but let me correct you there, because what we have to do is we have to detach the overall goal, right? The overall goal is to get a job, and one of the things we have to understand about dealing with this type of uncertainty is we have to keep the goal the overarching end state goal available, but and we have to understand it, but then we have to release it. Okay. In other words, when you're eating the elephant one bite at a time, it doesn't do a lot of good to back up and look at the whole elephant again, other than to understand, hey, this is what's going on. So I think what you said is true, but we have to take away one piece. If I'm looking for a job and I don't know when I'm going to get one, I have to say, okay, what can I control in this moment? I'm going to control filling out 10 job applications. I'm going to do that. I'm going to send them off. That's my horizon. I'm going to complete that task. I've created a DPO. I'm going to reward myself for that task. As soon as that's done, I need to back up again. I need to kind of come out again and say, okay, what's my next thing I'm going to control? I think we tend to want to jump ahead to the overall goal. The saying in Buds, specifically Hell Week, okay, Doug, is that if you think about Friday on Monday, you will quit, right? So the idea is in Hell Week, you're never thinking about Friday, So in the relation is I'm never thinking about getting the job. I know getting the job is the goal, but getting the job is way too far down the road. I just need to focus on what I can do in this moment and keep on moving that way. And then eventually I'll get closer and closer to that end goal, because you don't think about Friday during Hell Week until Friday. Because you'll quit. So
and you hear a lot about controlling the controllables. I've talked about it on the show. You've talked about it. I think a lot of personal development, podcasts and people in the space have talked about the importance of that. I think people get I don't want to say they get lost, but they're like, all right, like how do I identify those things? Like how do I identify the things that I can control that are pertinent to what I'm going through?
To change the verbiage a little bit, it's not necessarily about controlling the controllables. It's about creating a controllable. As soon as we decide to create a controllable, now we're in control, and so I think there's going to, when you're deeply steeped in uncertainty, challenge, and stress, what it means is that you are in an environment that is highly unknown. Almost everything around you is unknown and uncertain. So again, if we think about our first goal is to try to understand, part of our ability to understand what's going on is to begin to step through it. And the ability to step through it rests in the ability to say, okay, what can I actually control in this moment? I'm going to create a controllable for myself, you name an environment. Say you're lost. Okay. You're in a foreign country and you're lost. You need to ask yourself, okay, in this environment, what's the first thing I can control? What's a control I can take? Well, maybe I know generally what a police car looks like. So I'm going to look for the first police car and see, and that'll be my controllable, right? So you are going to create a controllable that you then move to in the hopes that movement will begin to generate more understanding of an environment.
What other steps can people take to really get crystal clear on how to create a framework to be able to navigate through uncertainty in a way that's maintainable, and they're not going to end up giving up on themselves?
For the very first thing is we have to understand what our body is doing and what our physiology is doing when it comes to autonomic arousal. So I know, you talked about it a bunch. But I'll just remind the audience, autonomic arousal is what happens when our body begins to get stressed and anxious. We shift into sympathetic nervous system mode and our autonomic arousal goes up. In some cases, our amygdala in our brain gets tickled. As that arousal gets up, we feel more and more anxious and maybe more and more fearful. We begin to approach what's called ultimately autonomic overload or amygdala hijack. This is when you've approached a situation, you've approached a level of arousal and stress and anxiety that your frontal lobe, because what happens is as your autonomic arousal goes up, your frontal lobe, your logical, conscious thinking mind begins to take a back seat to your limbic, which is your emotional brain. When we reach autonomic overload or amygdala hijack, what's happened there is our frontal lobe has now taken a full back seat, and now our limbic brain has taken over and we're acting without thinking. Okay, now that comes in very handy if you are jumping out of the way of a moving train or maybe pulling your hand off a hot stove. We don't have to wait and think about that. We want to be able to do it without thinking. However, in most environments in today's world, we want to actually engage in some conscious thought. We have to re-engage that frontal lobe so that we can actually start making some solid, grounded decisions. I think the first thing that people have to start understanding is that we can actually manage our physiology. We can bring down our autonomic arousal through specific certain tools, whether it be visual tools or breathing. We can talk about some of those. But we need to bring our autonomic arousal down by using some tools so that we're bringing our frontal lobe back online, and then begin to ask some questions about our environment. When you ask yourself, okay, what can I focus on or control in this moment? What you're doing is you're re-engaging your frontal lobe. You're quite deliberately re-engaging your frontal lobe. You're bringing that back into the fray, which is automatically helping your autonomic arousal go down. So I think most people are going to find that they feel, that they say, hey, when uncertainty, challenge, and stress hits, I start getting really anxious and worked up and freaked out, right? And often dip into two modalities. The first is panic, or one of them is panic. The other one is procrastinate. And panic is, and by the way, you can relate those to the fight or flight, right? Panic is basically doing without thinking. You're just acting in a frenzy, and you're not engaging in thought, conscious thought. Procrastinate is you're basically freezing. You're doing nothing. Okay, both of which don't offer good solutions in uncertainty, challenge, and stress. Both of which are happening without you putting any conscious movement or thinking, because I think once we start putting conscious movement and thinking into it, we can start choosing what to do. So the number one thing is control your autonomic arousal through breathing, through visual tools, so that you can bring that frontal lobe back online, start asking questions, and then begin working it out.
And what do you think is the most effective way, generally speaking, to like instantly reduce fear, stress, panic during uncertainty?
So one of the best ways is a breathing tool, which I you know about. It's called the physiological sigh. Okay, and what's happening there is when we are basically blowing CO2 out of our system. One of the things that people should understand is that when we get stressed, for example, when we're holding our breath, whether it be underwater or land, that stress we feel to breathe is not for a lack of oxygen. It's because of a buildup of CO2. This is something Navy SEALs typically learn, but free divers know this immensely, right? They know that they can push past that discomfort because there's a lot more oxygen in their system, so they can push that past, and they can go a lot longer than their body is telling them. I do not recommend doing this, because the problem with that is that once you get that initial warning and you've pushed past it, you don't get another warning. In other words, you will just go out, right? If you're holding your breath and you go through that discomfort and then you kind of get past it, at that point, your body will just pass out with no warning, right? So it's a very dangerous thing to do. But free divers do it all the time. All this to say that stress is a buildup of CO2. And one of the things we can do immediately to actually bring our autonomic arousal down is to begin to blow out our CO2. The physiological sigh is simply a breathing tool, where you sit and you take a huge inhale, so as much as you can, then you top it off, and then you blow out very slowly. Okay, so big inhale, top it off, and then blow out very slowly. If you do that 4, 5, 6 times, you will begin to feel yourself calm down. That's an immediate way through breathing that you can actually bring your autonomic arousal down, and you can start to re-engage your frontal lobe, your conscious thinking.
I would imagine that you can't do that all day. And sometimes when life happens, people are stressed and they have bouts of panic like all day, every day for a period of time, until they either control their autonomic nervous system or they get some good news where they have a better understanding of where life is going to be headed. I know you talk a lot about like action in a way being like the solution for some of this stuff, for uncertainty, and like stack these small wins. Talk about the process after you calm your autonomic nervous system, and why taking action can actually be the key to solving a lot of this fear, worry, panic, etc.
Well, it's because once you take action, you're making a decision, which means you're engaging your frontal lobe, and you're creating for yourself, as long as you've done the process of creating a DPO through picking a horizon, you're creating a certainty for yourself. So while I agree with you, is that a lot of people find themselves in a situation where they feel themselves panicking for a lot, maybe, I would say all day, but I would say, panic comes in spurts, and we can actually control those spurts through our physiology. Once you bring your physiology to a state where you can actually start asking questions and taking action, it's really about saying, okay, what can I focus on in this moment? What's a DPO? What's a horizon I can pick, a DPO I can create, and I'm going to move to that. As soon as you pick something to do, you have now taken action, and that action will allow you the space to get that thing done, whatever that is, so that once you're done with that thing, you can then ask the question again, and then ask the question again. And again, those horizons can be long, they can be short, they can be whatever the appropriate amount is for your specific situation, but you are literally creating things to do by creating DPOs, creating horizons. So manage your physiology. As soon as you manage your physiology, begin to then re-engage your frontal lobe by creating a DPO through picking a horizon. Move to that. Once you're there, you will register a reward because you're going to get dopamine for that reward. I did it. I'm done. That mission complete for that. That will allow you then to come back out and ask the question again. Okay, now what can I focus on? It's quite reminiscent of a rock climber climbing up a really steep face, that might be at an angle that climber cannot see the top, or maybe even can't even see more than 10 feet in front. And that climber is quite literally going from foothold to foothold or handhold to handhold. I mean, going foot by foot, 3 feet by 3 feet, and just chunking that environment. They're making decisions and taking movements. So they move across that pathway in a way that either gets them through the uncertainty, so they're done, achieves the goal, or creates enough certainty that now the anxiety goes down.
I think sometimes people also have a hard time with, like, how do I know, like, how big of a next step should I take? Right? Like, I mean, it's the easiest analogy is the gym. Like, for me, like, I know I can, tomorrow, if I want to, like, continue to work on building my chest, I know I can throw a certain amount of weight on the bar and do that, where other people are like, I don't know if I can put that much weight on a bar to be able to bench, right? So once people have calmed their nervous system, done this physiological side that, Andrew's talked about and you've talked about a lot, how can they figure out how big of a step they need to take?
Yeah, that's a great question, and the answer is to experiment. And I would say experiment by starting small, because it's worse to start too big, because then you deplete your dopamine. So start small, and then as you start with the small steps, you ask yourself, okay, can I make my next one a little bit longer? So a great practice is, Doug, on this, and Andrew and I figured this out when we were doing, is one of the best places to practice this is in the cold plunge, because the cold plunge always sucks.
It does always suck.
I mean, I was a SEAL for 21 years, and I got in this morning, and I still did not want to get in. Okay, every time I get into that thing, I don't want to get in. It is pure misery in that sense, right? But it's a great, great venue inside of which to practice this stuff. And one of the things I did when I was first introducing the cold plunge to my wife and son, who wanted to try it, I said, okay, well, here's what we're going to do. As soon as you get into that water, I'm going to have you look at my hands and count to 10. Okay. So I'm basically, in essence, giving them a DPO. I'm giving them a horizon, okay? And they got in, they looked at my hand, they counted 10. I said, okay, now pick someplace else to look and pick another number, right? And they picked another place and maybe counted to 15, and then maybe counted to 20. But the idea was, and they both were able to do a minute and a half for their very first time, But the idea is you can get into these systems or get into these environments where you say, hey, I'm going to pick a horizon, and you're going to go execute that horizon, execute that DPO. And you're able to say to yourself, okay, wait, I can create a longer one. If you're in the gym, and the gym is a great analogy too. The only thing about the gym is it's not really uncertain, but we're DPOing a lot in the gym because there's pain, there's challenge, right? And we can say, I don't feel like working out, and I have to do 4 different sets of legs. Okay, I'm not going to focus on the other 3 things. I'm going to focus on the first thing I'm going to do, maybe squats, and I'm going to focus on the first set. That's my initial horizon, initial DPO. I'm going to do that. Okay, now I'm going to focus on the next 2 or next 3, whatever it is. It's a great way to practice modulating these horizons in a way that's meaningful. But the key is experiment. Pick something, start small. Definitely recommend start smaller, but extend it out and see how that works for people. See how it works for you. The cool thing, Doug, is if you do this enough consciously, if you make the conscious effort to do this type of work enough, you will begin to do it unconsciously. And this is when you become a master of uncertainty. Navy SEALs do this unconsciously. We do it without thinking. When the shit goes down around us, we immediately calm ourselves and ask ourselves, what are we going to focus on? What do we focus on now? What do we move to this? And it's a very rapid process because it's very natural for us. The good news is every human being does this anyway. We just have to, a lot of us don't think about when we do it. And what I try to do is I try to deconstruct it and articulate it in a way that allows someone to actually practice it.
What can somebody do if they are picking these new horizons, they're mastering their ability to calm their nervous system, whatever way works for them? They've got this, these goals they're working on, they're working towards them, and just stuff's not happening. Let's just say like 6 months go by, nothing's going on. 9 months go by, nothing's going on, and yet they're continuing to do the right things, but yet they're like, something's got to give. And then I think that adds fuel to uncertainty, because they're like, wow, like I thought that if I did the right thing for a period of time, like I thought that I would end up having this thing. So how can people avoid falling into the victim mindset and keep going when the uncertainty becomes even more and more unclear?
I think there's a couple ways that can help, and that is part of what I talk about in the book is understanding ourselves and understanding who shows up in uncertainty. And so one of the things I talk about in the book is mastering yourself. And by mastering yourself, I mean, okay, who's the person that shows up in uncertainty? To understand that, we need to understand a couple things. First of all, we need to understand attributes. And you and I have talked about attributes, and then I'm kind of the attributes guy, right? But, whatever attributes we're bringing to the table starts to inform how we're going to show up in stress, challenge, and uncertainty, okay? If we understand that about ourselves, it gives us some latitude on dealing with this stuff long term. If I know I'm low on adaptability, that means I know that when I'm going through this, whatever it is, for however long it is, as things come at me unplanned, the environment changes around me, it's going to be uncomfortable. That knowledge in of itself is really good because A, it helps you understand it and deal with it, but B, it also helps you maybe seek out some help from someone who might be more adaptable. You can actually seek help out from people who actually have who are higher on the attributes you're low on. But all this to say is understanding your attributes is important. Another very powerful driver of human performance and behavior is identity, and the identities that we carry into any given environment. And the idea is that as human beings, we actually carry several identities. We actually collect identities as we go through our lives, and those identities can be everything from small things to very large, important things. Right? It could be I was a high school lacrosse player. I went to this college. I'm a Navy SEAL. I'm a husband, father. If you're religious, I'm a Christian. It could be I'm a Metallica fan or a Ravens fan, whatever that is. Every single one of these identities, we have to understand, comes with some rules and conditions that define our ability and our presence in that club, if you will. All right. One of the things that we can do to keep us going is to understand which identities we prioritize, because we're always gonna lean on the identities we prioritize the most, and then understand and lean on those when things don't seem to be going our way. So what's an example of this? Two of my most powerful identities, as you might imagine, was I am a Navy SEAL. Okay. That was a powerful, I'm not a Navy SEAL anymore, but it was a powerful identity. And then the other one, I am a husband and father. Okay. Those are very two powerful identities for me. When I was overseas deployed, obviously my Navy SEAL identity was the predominant one. That was the prioritized one. And there were moments when things were going on, and that identity helped me move through, because I was like, listen, I'm a Navy SEAL. That's my identity. This is what I do. Because I'm a Navy SEAL, I'm going to figure out. Because I'm a Navy SEAL, I'm going to keep going. I'm never going to quit. Those are the rules and conditions that come with that identity. And so I think anybody can do some work, and I give some exercises in the book on how to figure this out, but understand which are your most powerful identities, and start understanding how and when we can lean on those identities during those times of what seem to be interminable stress and challenge. Okay, because it's going to feel that way, and interminable stress and challenge does exist. But making meaning and making horizons in certain moments and picking things to focus on is in fact the key. I know you've read it. It's one of your the books you consider a great one. Man's Search for Meaning, the story of a Holocaust survivor, and his ability for him to actually pull at least some semblance of meaning and good from his time in a concentration camp, for God's sakes, right? I mean, if you can do it in a concentration camp, you can do it when you're in a period of your life that seems like it's just ongoing, whether it be joblessness or trying to find the right person. All you need to do is start thinking about meaning, think about identity, and thinking about how you are designed to behave in those moments.
And I think one of the identities that can come up for people specifically during adversity or uncertainty is I'm a loser, I'm a failure, I'm a piece of crap, right? Depending on the situation. And I think if you think like that long enough, that's your default for when uncertainty hits. So you'll say things like, well, the reason my life is not where I want it to be, or why I've had this speed bump, is because the world's out to get me. I'm a loser, blah, blah, blah. What's the framework to kind of recalibrate your mindset if your default is I'm a failure, the world's against me. Like, how can people, transcend that identity into something more positive?
Okay, a couple things there. First of all, just know that whatever that identity is, if you say I'm a loser, that comes with rules and conditions as well. To stay a loser requires for you to behave in a certain way. So as soon as you say I'm a loser, you are instructing your physiology and your neurology towards behaving like a loser. That's what you're doing. Now, I want to just highlight that because just sometimes knowing that helps people kind of reframe. One real powerful trick, and I know you and I talked about this even on the last podcast, but it bears repeating, is this idea that our brains, because we are question answering machines, our brains are constantly interrogating the environment through, asking questions about it. When we place a question into our frontal lobe, when we ask a question, our brain immediately begins to come up with answers. Okay, immediately. And I do this exercise with groups. I say, okay, I'm going to give you a question. Usually, it's how could I double my income in the next six months? Right. I'll give you 30 seconds. Write down anything that pops in your head. And typically, people write down 5, 6, or 7 things. The idea behind that exercise is not necessarily the question. It's the fact that as soon as you place a question in your frontal lobe, your brain will begin to come up with answers. Now, some of them might be ridiculous because selling a kidney is not a good idea to double your income, right? But the idea is top performers, the highest performers on the planet, they always ask better questions. They change the questions they ask, and they ask better ones. So instead of saying, why am I such a loser? Because your brain will begin to give you some fabulous reasons as to why you're a loser. You say, how can I learn from this? What's a way I can grow? What's a way I can move through? Who's out there that can help me? Okay. That changing the framework of your questions will change the answers. It changes your neurological focus. This is borne out even in our physiology. The example is this. When I was a SEAL, I got to go to a bunch of different driving schools, like racing schools and things like that. I loved every one of them because I love driving. And whenever you go to a racing school, one of the first things they teach you is how to get out of a spin. When your car starts to spin out or get out of control, how to get out of that. And one of the things they'll tell you is that once your car starts to lose control and get into a spin situation, never look at the wall. Okay, because if you look at the wall, you're going to hit the wall. They basically said, look where you want to go, because if you look where you want to go, even if the wall's in your vision, if you're looking where you want to go, your body is going to begin to respond and take you there. Same thing happens with our brain. And so one of the ways we can help ourselves get out of a negative loop like that is to simply change the quality of questions we're asking ourselves and ask better ones. If you find yourself saying, man, I'm such a loser. Why am I such a loser? Stop and say, wait a second. Let me ask a better question. Why am I a winner? What makes me a winner? And start coming up with those answers. Or how can I grow from this? It's one of the reasons why the essence of the whole DPO Move the Horizon process is asking a question about your environment. What can I control in this moment? You're asking a question, and your brain's going to start giving you answers. So I think that's one really powerful tool that can be implemented in a situation where someone feels themselves descending into one of these more destructive identities or self-talk situations.
What are some of the actions that people can take, generally speaking, that will help them feel more confident and feel better about themselves in moments of uncertainty? Like, is it exercise? I mean, you've mentioned the cold plunge. Like, what are some habits?
Certainly, there are some distinct habits that will allow us to feel more confident. I think you hit some of them. Exercise, what we eat matters. It really does. We know that. You talk about that all the time, right? I mean, garbage in, garbage out, so what we eat, exercise, sleep, all this stuff to help someone feel more confident and helpful and powerful in their own skin are important. So there are important things to do. But I will say this, just simple physiological changes in the moment can in fact help. In the moment of feeling uncertainty, challenge, or stress, or low, or whatever, just standing tall, straightening your shoulders, holding your shoulders back, and taking a big breath changes your physiology. It changes the way you view the world. Okay. It also changes the way the world views you, by the way. I mean, if I were to ask someone right now, or ask you, or say, hey, just sit in a way that you're depressed. Okay. How that would look. It'd be slumped shoulders. It would be head down. It'd be kind of shallow breathing. That's what depression looks like. Okay. But now sit in a way that you're confident. Okay. Well, we know that looks like too. That's straight. That's shoulders back. That's taking a deep breath. That's like, hey, I got this type thing. Physiology is a very rapid way to change our state. And by changing our state, we can get into these modalities a lot faster.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. I think people have a hard time during uncertainty, and they have, at times, it can be challenging to do like the next right thing, right? It can be challenging to do the next right thing. And I think what tends to happen for a lot of people, especially people who have listened to the podcast, is they do the next wrong thing, right? They have a hard time controlling their nervous system. They have a hard time not giving in to that instant gratification. They have a hard time not future tripping. And they turn to things like drugs and alcohol to calm themselves down in the near term. Is there anything else other than what I just described? Like, what are some of the things that will make matters worse for somebody during a time of uncertainty?
First of all, we just have to also know that when someone slips into some of those negative behaviors, what they're doing is they're chasing the exact same chemical that you get when you shift horizons properly. It's dopamine. Okay. And so you can get the same reward of dopamine that you get when you drink or eat or do whatever the behavior is to escape. You can get that same reward simply by shifting your horizons and creating these DPOs. So that's number one thing. One of the most inhibiting things one can do is to focus on what's already happened. Worry about the past. There's nothing you can do to change the past. And so one of the things that top performers and top performing teams do is we don't, other than learning from it, we don't worry about it. Worry is a useless emotion. So we don't worry about the past because we can't change it. And in addition to that, this is going to be a little bit harder. We don't worry too much about the future either. Okay. If there are things that are outside of our control in the future, we're not going to worry about those. It doesn't mean we don't plan. It doesn't mean we don't prepare. Okay. But what it means is we're not going to worry about that in the moment. Here, I'll give you a quick example. One of the things that we do in the SEAL teams was one of the insertion methods was called a HAHO, high altitude, high opening parachute operations. Okay. For the audience, for those in the audience who may not know what this is. So for years, when we talk about skydiving, there was what were military operations called HALO. It was created so that an airplane could fly at 20,000 feet or something over a target way above earshot range. And operators could drop out of that airplane and skydive, basically free fall until they're about 2,000 feet and pull their parachute and they're right there. Okay. That was HALO, high altitude, low opening. Well, one day a guy someone got into their head that they said, hey, wait a second. What if we jump out at 22,000 feet and we just count to 4 and pull our chutes? And so our chutes open up at 20,000 feet. And now we can fly our chutes a nice long distance to where we need to go. Okay. So that's called a HAHO, high altitude, high opening. Obviously, that involves a lot of training. You have to be on oxygen. You have a bunch of gear, all that stuff. You have compasses. You have GPS as you're trying to figure out where you're going. Okay. All this to say, I remember we would have operations where we'd be doing a high altitude, high opening insert. So you're talking about you're jumping out of an airplane, you're opening your parachute at 20,000 feet, you're flying to a drop zone somewhere. Once you get to that drop zone, you're then patrolling into a target area. You're conducting a target, and then you're having to get off that target. Okay, huge. You can think of the enormity of that whole situation. I remember I was talking to a couple of my buddies. This was a couple months ago. We were having lunch. These are guys I served with. And we were talking about one of these operations. All right. It was a HAHO operation, huge operation. We're going to jump in, go do this target, all that stuff. And I remember my buddy saying, it's funny. When you're in that airplane and the ramp goes down, you're just getting ready to jump out. There's only one thing I'm thinking. I said, what's that? He's like, nail the exit. And what do I mean by that? It's because when you go out of that airplane, if you don't exit that aircraft in a stable manner, your chute's not going to open properly. Okay. So you have to be very focused on getting out of the airplane and nailing that exit. Okay. All this to say is out of all of that just massive operation that was in front of all of us, every single one of us were only thinking one thing when that ramp opened, and that is nail the exit. As soon as we nail the exit, there's something else. The next thing we're thinking, open our parachute. Okay, pull our ripcord, open our parachute. Once the parachute's open, okay, get on heading. Okay, now I'm going to fly. And this is an exact example of you're picking your horizons, and you're setting your DPOs in a manner that's not worrying about. I'm not worried about the targets and all that stuff that's downstream. Now I've prepared for it, yes, and that doesn't negate proper planning, but what we can't do is focus on things that we can't control in the moment, because that's worry and that's useless. So long answer to your question, but I think if we can say to ourselves, hey, I refuse to worry about the past because that's already done, and I refuse to worry too far into the future. I'm going to worry about what I can control in this moment. I've already planned. I've already prepared. So it's not like I'm not unprepared for what's coming, but I'm not going to worry about what's coming. I'm going to focus on the moment. That's what I would say is a very powerful technique.
Right. So essentially, it's like brain switching, I guess, in a way, switching from your emotional state to your logical state, right?
It's controlling your emotions to a degree that allow you to operate. Because again, emotions are fantastic, but you can think of them as the fuel. Okay, emotions can fuel you, but they don't necessarily. Fuel used incorrectly can either do nothing or cause explosions, right? You have to use it very precisely. And so you can use emotion to fuel you. If you're actually thinking logically through a situation, then you can throw on some emotion to fuel it, maybe make faster. But a lot of people let their emotions lead, and that's just like throwing fuel on something, and there's no piston directing that energy into the crankshaft, which is then directing that energy into the tires, which are actually moving the vehicle.
I guess like people might be, if they research you, they'll see like what you did in your career. I mean, you were in the SEALs for a long time in a very like elite group, and you had, a high level of responsibility, and you had to think super fast and on your feet. And I would imagine you're a very logical guy, right? To be able to execute the way that you do. And while I think we all have some level of logical thinking within us, some just aren't as logical as others, and they maybe lean more towards the emotional side. Do you think there's a way for people to become more logical in their thinking?
And the way is to deliberately ask better questions about one's environment. Okay, emotion aside, ask better questions about one's. Now we can, even those of us who are more emotional, can help that emotional response through some of these techniques, breathing and stuff, so that emotion doesn't get too out of hand. But as soon as we begin to ask questions about our environment, we are engaging that logical thinking process. As soon as we do it, doesn't matter how emotional we are. It's kind of like the psychologist whole thing, name it to tame it type thing. They say, hey, name the emotion. If you name the emotion, it actually helps you tame that emotion. It's because you're engaging your conscious thinking. You're engaging your frontal lobe. You're putting some top down control on that limbic system by naming it. And all we're saying here is begin to name your environment by asking better questions. And so don't make your over emotionality an excuse. It can actually be a very powerful tool in some cases. Just know that you can actually help more effectively engage the logical thinking, the conscious thought, by asking questions quite deliberately. And I think the person who's more emotional might have to just be more deliberate about it versus the person who's too logical. Now, I would even say if you're too logical, that can have some side effects too, because if you're too logical, you're not actually using fuel. You're not actually using that emotional fuel to actually get you moving even faster, kind of throw that power into the system. So too logical can be just as bad as too emotional. What we want to do is try to find a balance here.
One of the things that I think often gets overlooked in times of its uncertainty is procrastination, right? Because people are so focused on the physiological stuff that happens, the anxiety, the fear, the worry, the stress that we've been talking about, and you've extensively described how to get through that. But I think if people procrastinate and they don't get stuff done because they're just like frozen, like that leads to a variety of other issues, right? Talk about the quickest way for people to essentially like erase procrastination.
I would say procrastination, it becomes way more predictable in our behavior if we have surrounded ourselves with things to distract ourselves. One of the problems with today's environment is we have so many ways to escape our environment. And when you escape your environment, you are in essence procrastinating. That's what's happening, right? So, and it could be just on our phone alone. We have, at least 25 different apps we could use to escape our current situation. And so I think one of the things we have to do is we have to recognize that these defaults that sometimes we're thinking are fairly benign or harmless are in fact exacerbating a procrastination mode. A decision to do nothing in the moment is not necessarily procrastination, as long as it's a decision to do nothing. So in other words, you may decide, you know what, I'm seeing everything that's going on here. I am going to decide to hold position for a second. I'm going to wait. I'm going to wait and I'm just to see what happens. Okay. That is in fact a decision. That is taking action. That is not procrastinating. That is a deliberate decision. One of the ways that you can describe this. So back in Vietnam days, the Viet Cong, when they were hiding out in the jungles, they used to know that some American patrols were somewhat trigger happy. And so what they do is they just fire their weapons just randomly in the air. And as soon as they did that, they knew that some American patrols would just start firing back, and that would immediately pinpoint for those Viet Cong where that American patrol was, called recon by fire. So in other words, the Viet Cong would fire their weapons to taunt, to draw out the fire of the Americans so that they knew exactly where the Americans were positionally. When the spec operators got there, whether they were Green Berets or SEALs or whatever, they recognized this was happening. And so their first action when they heard gunfire was not to shoot their guns. Their first action was to stop and do nothing, to hold, to see if they could figure out what was going on. Okay. It's actually a tactic that holds true to this day. Even when I was in Iraq and Afghanistan, just because we heard gunfire did not mean someone started firing their guns, right? We stopped and said, okay, what's going on? So all this to say, the decision in that moment was to do nothing, okay? And it's okay if you're making a decision to do nothing. What you don't want to find yourself doing is doing nothing because it's an escape or default. You're escaping from the problem, which, again, elimination of distractions, or at least a recognition of the distractions in our lives, is a way to help reduce that whole problem.
What are some things people can do, like long term, when it comes to dealing with uncertainty? Like we've talked about what to do when things kind of get super negative in your life, but let's face it, like life is uncertain every day, right? And I think that if people can focus on being more present and just kind of, I mean, not just living in the moment, because I think that's kind of bad too, in a way where if you don't set goals and you don't, shoot for the stars when it comes to your life, I think that can create a subset of problems. But how do you think people can effectively just live life in a way where they're more present and they're not so worried about what's going to happen every day?
First of all, practicing these techniques is going to help. Okay. And again, you can practice just moving horizons every day with in certain capacity. You can practice it for very small things all the way to big things. You can just practice picking a horizon, creating a DPO, and moving towards it. If you practice this and get into it, one of the gifts that you get as a master of uncertainty is that you are not only deft at dealing with uncertainty when it hits you, you're also someone who goes and seeks it out. Okay. And we know that the key to success in life is to seek out our discomfort, is to step outside of our comfort zone. As a master of uncertainty, you can do is you begin to look for places where you can actually throw yourself into uncertainty so you can learn and grow, because that's where growth happens. It happens outside of our comfort zone. So I think practicing this and getting good at it and getting comfortable with it not only sets you up for when it happens without you even expecting it, it also creates an environment where you now can go seek it out. You actually can take your whole life to a new level because you can stop being afraid of trying that new thing. You can actually go jump into that new thing because you have the techniques and the tools to do that. As a Navy SEAL, one can probably guess that I didn't do a lot of public speaking, okay, and in front of audiences and things like that. I did a couple because I had to do a couple speeches when I, was an officer, but the whole public speaking thing was something that I had to really dive into because it's not something I necessarily was excited to do. Public speaking is not something many people like to do. But I knew that stepping outside of the comfort zone and trying that new thing was akin to me growing and getting better and being and becoming a better, more rounded, more knowledgeable person. So I think that if folks can just begin to practice this on a more habitual level, it will become habitual to the extent that you now find yourself thriving in uncertainty. And you're going to go seek out uncertainty. You're going to try new things. You're going to try the new job, try to write in the book, do whatever that goal. You're going to pick a goal that you may otherwise have put on the shelf because of your fear of uncertainty, challenge, and stress. And that's a real beautiful power to have.
Right. So it's essentially like this idea of challenging yourself every day, finding ways to become more resilient, and kind of not being afraid to take that next step in your life and setting realistic expectations. I mean, I love talking about habits and what people can do, to practice getting comfortable, being uncomfortable. And I think obviously the easiest things that I think about are things like fitness, things like sitting in the sauna, the cold plunge. If you're somebody who's single, like going up and asking, talking to like random people in like a grocery store and asking people out, like things that might, in a way be uncomfortable because there's the fear of rejection and fear of failure. But the more you do it, the less you become afraid of it. So what are some things that you think are just standards that people should do every day that will help them build resilience?
Yeah, that's a great question, Doug. I tend to hesitate because people are so different. But I would say that, again, we've heard Huberman talk about the anterior mid-cingulate cortex, which is a part of the brain that literally grows when you do things you don't want to do. It's part of the brain that does that, which means we as human beings need to start figuring out on a daily basis, okay, what are those things I don't want to do, and maybe do it, and again, you can find those experiences in the gym. Listen, I was out this morning. I do hills here in Virginia Beach. I run up this huge hill several times with a weight vest on. It's not like I love to do it. I have to push myself to do it, but I do it. Getting in the cold plunge is something I do. I don't like to do it. I just do it. This is what is going to grow our brains and grow that part of that brain and allow us to actually do better and be more of a whole and fulfilled human. I will say that there's one thing that I think people can apply that is a little bit of, I won't say hack, because it might cheapen it a little bit, but that is this idea of curiosity. When Andrew and I were kind of talking about this idea that uncertainty plus anxiety equals fear, one of the things that occurred to me is that, yes, that's true. However, if you say uncertainty and then you add curiosity, that actually produces excitement. Okay, so you can quite literally change sometimes your fear into excitement just by shifting your anxiety to curiosity. What do I mean? Well, for example, the person who is afraid or nervous about going up to that other person and starting up a conversation because of rejection, which, by the way, is most of us. I would feel the same way. What if you were to say, you know what? I'm really curious to see what happens here. I'm immensely curious, and I'm just going to try it just because I'm immensely curious. Whether it goes great, whether it goes bad, I'm just curious. That changes your demeanor on how you're going to actually approach that whole situation. You can actually begin to deliberately implement curiosity and start to change things into a more exciting venture versus something you're actually hesitant to do. It does, now again, it's not a full 100% fix. There's still going to be some anxiety there, but just understanding, again, putting that frontal lobe in the forefront and adding consciously, hey, I'm going to be curious about this. I wonder what's going to happen. I'm curious to see what happens. That can actually really help someone do this more habitually. So if I would say, if there's any habits that one can do, is start setting DPOs or start picking horizons, i.e. setting DPOs more habitually, and start adding curiosity into the mix more habitually. And that will actually enable a whole different experience of life.
Anything that we didn't cover that you think the audience would find useful when it comes to mastering uncertainty, reducing fear, worry, panic, stress, etc. in the moment?
I think we covered it all, Doug. I do want to just say that, there's a huge focus out there and push from many of us who are in the space in terms of talking about the importance of challenging oneself and pushing oneself outside their comfort zone and doing that type of stuff. And I want to make sure that we're always emphasizing that. But what I also want to emphasize for people is that we also have to be resilient. We also have to recover. Okay. It's okay to not push yourself one day. It's okay to actually do something that is completely joyful and just recover. So the idea is, don't fall into the trap that this has to be something that is your entire life's being, is I'm constantly pushing, I'm constantly challenging. Make a balance, create a balance of, I'm going to challenge myself, I'm going to push myself out of my comfort zone. Once I do that, I'm going to live in the present moment. I'm going to register that reward. I'm going to feel good. I might take a rest. I might escape somehow, do some sort of escape activity, do some recovery, and then I'm going to do it again. The key is, don't get trapped into either polarity, right? Balance the polarities in a way that is meaningful for you and allows you to consistently set and achieve the goals that you want to achieve.
Rich Diviney, thank you so much for coming back on the podcast.
My pleasure, brothers. It's always great. So thank you.
You got it, man.
Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, I really think you're going to like this video as well. I'll see you there.